Hello, welcome to our session. Let's start with a disclaimer. Apologize, I have a sore throat, guys, but I try to do my best today. So this presentation may contain product features or functionality that are currently under development. You can continue with the rest. My name is Daniel Massini. I'm a senior staff architect for the networking and security service portfolio for VMware. I'm based in Dallas, Texas.
Hello, everyone. My name is Casey Reed. I am a staff architect at VMware, also working in our CSS network and security portfolio for network and security, based in Michigan. So we'll start today by quickly going over our agenda for today's session. We'll begin by discussing the path to securing your infrastructure, where we will review some of the benefits, processes, and focus areas for hardening and assessing your VMware environment. And then we will review some best practice checklists for a few of our VMware products to give you some best practices on focus areas for hardening your environments. And then we will review some resources to give you guys some additional information on how to harden and assess your environment along your VMware journey. And then we will have some Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please hold those to the end of this session. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. We will also have a QR code at the end of the session for you to be able to download this presentation. All right. So who here has heard of ransomware? I know, stupid question, right? Fileless malware attacks, generative AI attacks. As IT and cybersecurity professionals, we're not only facing an increase in global cyber attacks, 38% in 2022, but attackers who are leveraging the latest and greatest technologies. We're seeing attackers not only continuously targeting our endpoints, but who are increasingly targeting sometimes our vulnerable VMware infrastructure. ESXi, for example, has become increasingly targeted in recent years, not only due to the popularity of vSphere, but because sometimes we focus so much on hardening and protecting the edge of our environments, the edge of our networks, our endpoints, that we can put these critical infrastructure components kind of on the back burner. But in today's threat landscape, it's become increasingly important that we take the proper steps to make sure that we have increased the security posture and ultimately reduce that risk profile of our VMware environment. Daniel?
Thanks, Casey. So you heard Casey talking about this number. Really, everybody is scared about security these days. Cybersecurity is a key topic for organizations these days. So let's start defining, at least from the VMware point of view, what are the steps to secure your infrastructure, right? First of all, we start with evaluating the current infrastructure on VMware. What does it mean, right? We're trying to identify what are the gaps that you have in your environment. What is security control that you need to take care of? What are the main application and infrastructure that you need to protect it? You need to make sure that you ensure the protection of your organization. But to do that, first of all, you need to assess and identify what we're going to be assessing this day. So how we start with that? First of all, you need to start looking at what are the critical component of organization these days. Budget is really important these days. Some organizations, they say, I need to protect everything. But in reality, most of our customers are really conscious about the budget. So the first thing that we need to understand is, let's identify and align what are really the top priorities of the organization. The second thing is the strategy. We need to really look at what are my organization goals, what are really my priority, and what is the impact of these goals in my organization strategy. We need to look at the regulation. We need to start looking at really what I want to achieve. Is because I wanted to achieve some compliance, or really it's because this application is top priority, and I really make sure that it's making money in my organization. To do that, this is step 2. There are 3 main components that you need to evaluate. Number 1 is the business risk. Really, if something happened to my organization, how will it impact my business? Because everything that we are doing here, all of you are here is because we're making money for the company or the organization. We need to always make sure that this is the top priority. Second thing, again, what is the impact? Again, there will be hundreds of servers. There will be so many XI hosts, VCF, etc. What are really the main data centers that are high priority? And number 3, what are the tools that we have today that we can reuse to really implement or protect our environment? We notice that some customers today, they have so many tools, and even the networking and security team, they don't know about the system of these tools, right? So before they start really looking at what are my alternatives in the market, let's start asking what we have today. And number 3, hardening our environment. Really, we need to enhance the security, the resiliency. We need to protect just not the network, the legacy network, as well as our virtualized environment. Everybody here, I'm pretty sure, that they have a cloud environment already running. Could be on-prem, on the private cloud, or public cloud, and so on. So again, we need to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system. In the next slide, I'm going to be talking more about assessment. So we have been talking to many customers today about security. Typically, our customers, when they're interested in security, the first thing that they do is talking to VMware and say, I want to improve my security posture. What should I do? And then we come back with other questions and say, how do you feel today? How secure are you? What are the main issues that you think you can face in case of a cyber attack or a ransomware issue? Do you have any remediation plan in case of something goes wrong? Other customers are more, or they have more interest on achieving some compliance. And they wanted just to do this assessment because they wanted to achieve compliance. But what is the plan? How all of these things are organized to do all of this? So really, what it made our attention, or what I wanted to transmit to you guys is, we noticed that everybody in this world is trying to improve security posture, but everybody's going in different directions. So the idea today, from Case and myself, is to give you an overview. Really, what are the tools that we can have, and what are the best practices to do this? So when we're looking at this process, what I wanted to make sure is the main intention of this security assessment is to improve the overall security posture. We need to evaluate what are the threats, the vulnerability, the risk, the compliance, the requirements of the organization. The main outcomes, as I mentioned before, you need to just not focus on tool, hardware, software. We need to look at the whole, at the processes, at the team, at the organization, especially because we are working, most of the company, in silos. When we're looking at assessment, we are suggesting to our customer that at least every 2 years, you have to have an assessment. We have been talking to customers that they haven't had any assessment in 5 years, and they don't even know how to start with assessment. So again, you need to start evaluating infrastructure, evaluating your assets, and looking at what are the major changes that happened in the last year. For example, if you guys develop a new data center, or you install a new XI host or VCF, please assess and try to harden your environment. The assessment process, again, like I mentioned, the idea to give you a high-level overview about how we define the assessment process today. Step number 1, we need to evaluate and find out what is the scope. We need to identify what are the assets, establish the objective, and align with the company goal. I mean, with that, we need to start collecting and looking at what the system, application, network that we are going to be assessing. As the second step, we're going to be gathering information, collecting, and putting somehow a kind of a report, making sure that we have all of the information documented. And step 3, not just one department, multiple people are going to start looking at this information that we collected, getting the architecture, getting the processes, and starting analyzing really what is our current state. As the final, or step 4, we're going to be looking at reporting and roadmap. All of our findings are documented. We need to start, again, assessment processes is not something that's going to happen in one phase. You have to identify your priorities that you're going to be doing in phase 1, and then second, there are some dependencies that you need to do it per phases. As a step 5, we wanted to do remediation. What is remediation? It's really provide or establish configuration changes in your environment following the best practices that we're going to be talking at the end of the presentation. What are really the documents and tools that I can use to hardening our environment? Could be BCS, BSFit, NXS, etc. And finally, you need to follow up. All of the changes that we implemented, we have to monitor. We have to see the behavior and try to see if really the changes that we implemented today are doing good. So it's not one time, it's something that we have to continue doing it. I need some water very quick. So now, in this slide, at the high level, I'm representing what are the main areas from the VMware that we need to cover during the security assessment. For the assessment infrastructure, we're looking at the different components of the VMware product. I'm not going to name all of them because VMware has more than 200 products today, but we're looking at the BCS Sphere, NSX, all of the access control, the configuration, segmentation, networking, etc. For compliance, as I mentioned before, you need to evaluate your current state of the compliance. You need, if you wanted to achieve a compliant regulation like PCI or GPDR, etc., you need to make sure that you need to compare this regulation and see how can I achieve this compliance. And then when we're looking at virtual machine security, as you know, typically these days, customers are not creating only one VM or two VM. They have an image template. So when you are defining this image template using the VMware tools, or even some of them you have in-house tools, make sure that you incorporate as well the best practices for security. You need to evaluate if you really need to include on this template some other feature provided by, for example, NSS security like distributed firewall, micro-segmentation, isolation, or ATP. For disaster recovery and business continuity, what we have to do really is look at the plan, what kind of backup and recovery plan you have in place. For application security, typically what we do is authentication. We're checking how the API access look like, what is the encryption that we have in place. We review the access control, and we are testing the encryption of the communication between the user and the application. And finally, for governance and risk, we're looking at analyzing, assessing the current policies, procedure, and control for management risk in the organization. Today, big company, they have a specific department that they are in charge of the regulation and how they manage security. Some smaller company, they don't have a department in place. But together, if you have a good communication and a good plan, you can have a proper implementation plan in case of any issue. Now, again, these are high-level areas. We will go more in detail in the next slide. Now, Casey will continue with hardening.
Thanks, Daniel. All right, let's talk about hardening. So hardening is the process of implementing security best practices and disabling any unnecessary features or ports on a system. Typically, we're going to align our hardening to a cybersecurity framework as well as any compliance requirements that we may have. Hardening should be performed during the initial implementation of the system as well as throughout the system's lifecycle. Hardening is not just applying patches and saying, oh, I'm good, I'm patched, I'm current. No, with hardening, we're taking a very systematic approach to ensure that the system is configured in a secure manner. The main outcome we're trying to achieve here ultimately is reducing that attack surface. By reducing that attack surface, we're reducing our risk profile and ultimately the potential for any adverse impacts to our systems and ultimately to our business, as well as some of these other items you see listed there under outcomes. So how do I harden my environment? If you're asking yourself this question, we've put together kind of a simple process just to get you started. The first is determining scope and identifying your risks. So here we kind of need to understand what is defined in our security policies, our standards, what are our processes around hardening. We also need to understand the threats that are specific to our vertical and our lines of business. We need to understand what compliance requirements that we may have and have a good understanding of our architecture and where some of those critical systems and those systems that do have compliance requirements live within our environment. So once we have our scope, we then can develop our security plan. So our security plan is going to be that future state secure configuration of the system. Again, typically we want to align this to a cybersecurity framework like NIST, ISO, CIS, while also incorporating any compliance requirements that we may have, GDPR, HIPAA, SOX, PCI, just to name a few. When we're developing our security plan, we can leverage some prescriptive guidance from organizations such as DISA with their Secure Technical Implementation Guides, or STIGs, as well as CIS benchmarks. Next, we need to actually go about implementing those controls. When we're implementing our controls, VMware does provide some automation that can assist you in that process, but ultimately there will be manual steps you'll need to take when you're actually hardening your system. The important piece here is performing post-implementation verification after we've implemented those controls, to make sure that we haven't broke anything in the environment, right? Sometimes security is a trade-off, so we might need to balance the level of hardening that we're doing based on our environment, while also ensuring that the now current state configuration meets what we had defined in our security plan. Next, step 4 is monitoring and assessing our security posture. So here we are just kind of performing continuous monitoring of the configuration, watching for configuration drift. We can perform our security assessments, as Daniel talked about, do penetration tests, vulnerability tests, to ensure that that system is still secure, as well as identify any potential gaps. Next is maintain and update those controls. So here we're applying our patches, monitoring the threat landscape for any new threats that may happen or impact our systems, and then we update our plan and our configuration accordingly. And lastly, follow-up. Follow-up is just monitoring our infrastructure over time, updating our security policies, our standards, our processes. If there's any new directives that may impact our business or any new compliance requirements that come around, if there's any major architecture or network type changes in the environment, we may need to go back and address our security plan. Here are a few best practice kind of focus areas for your hardening efforts. The first is just security hardening. This is the settings that we can control via the management interface of the system. So tweaking some of those security-related parameters, disabling any of those unnecessary services, anything we're not using, applying our security patches, configuring our host-based firewalls. For network hardening, this is very important and will be a common theme kind of throughout the next couple slides, is we need to make sure that we are isolating the management plane and some of those critical network components of our VMware environment. It's really important that we have strong east-west protections in place to reduce the risk of attackers moving laterally in our environment. For virtual machine hardening, these are settings that we can control at that hypervisor level. So this is going to be in addition to the hardening that you're doing at the OS and application level. Access controls, we need to make sure we have strong access controls in place following industry standard best practices, like following the concept of least privilege, by implementing role-based access controls. We've had customers have issues here where they're using Active Directory and they have the domain admin security group. They got everyone in IT in that domain admin security group. And if an attacker or a bad actor is able to get themselves added to that security group, if that security group maybe has admin privileges into vSphere, we may now be giving someone the keys, inadvertently the keys to the kingdom if they can get access to that group. For encryption, we should be implementing SSL and TLS encryption for our network traffic, as well as leveraging some of the encryption features within our VMware products. This will help maintain the confidentiality of our data. Then lastly, for monitoring and logging, we should be monitoring and logging everything going on in the environment. This just gives us that visibility from both a performance and a security perspective. All right, so now we're going to talk about some best practices for a few of our VMware use cases. Now what you see here in these next 3 slides, we will focus on vSphere, VCF, and NSX. We only got 45 minutes, and VMware has a lot of products, so we can't get through everything. But we do want to give you guys some guidance on some best practices for hardening these components, these products. These checkboxes, this is not an all-encompassing list of everything you should be hardening. vSphere 8, for example, has over like 150 specific controls that we're recommending, but this gives you a good start and are some of the key areas to kind of focus your hardening efforts on. And then later in the presentation, Daniel's going to provide you that list of resources to help you really drill down and get more details into what you should be hardening for our products. So we'll start with virtual machines. So with virtual machines, again, these are things that we can control at the hypervisor level. I like to think of these as virtual machine management settings. So the common theme here is controlling how the user interacts with the virtual machine, and then controlling, removable devices like disabling the USB drive, the CD/DVD drive, the floppy drive. This can prevent an attacker from potentially mounting those drives and then installing some malicious software. We can also configure settings like secure boot to ensure that the VMs are booting with only approved software. Disable copy and paste, drag and drop operations. And then we're leveraging vMotion encryption to, again, maintain the confidentiality of that VM while it's being migrated across your environment. For ESXi hosts, again, the ESXi hosts are valuable targets in today's threat landscape. So we really need to prioritize the hardening of our hosts. Again, by limiting access to the host and then enabling some of the strong security features that are available for protecting our hosts. SSH, for example, should be disabled by default, and leave it disabled until we are doing maintenance and troubleshooting. So if we have a change control, we need to do some maintenance on a host, we should enable SSH when we begin that change, and then once we've completed that change, we should then be disabling SSH on those hosts. We don't want to leave SSH open. We can configure the host firewall, our SIM access levels, the VIB acceptance levels. We can enable lockdown mode, a lot of things that we can do to better protect our hosts. And again, it's critical in today that these hosts, we prioritize that hardening of our hosts. Now, some of those things on our hosts isn't one size fits all, so you really have to understand your environment and whether or not you have some mitigating controls in place when you go about hardening your hosts. For vCenter, again, we want to ensure we restrict access not only to vCenter, but a couple of the roles in vCenter as well, like the cryptographic role and its permissions. We should be limiting which users can leverage those roles. The SSO account, and it adds some protections around that, and configure any alerting in case that SSO account is used. We can also configure that vCenter server firewall. We should be using approved certificates and leveraging hardened templates when we're deploying our virtual machines. For the virtual network, again, we really need to make sure that we are prioritizing the isolation of our key network components for our VMware environments. We have seen customers get hit time and time again where a user, they click that link in that email, their machine gets infected, and then that attacker is able to move laterally in their environment, ultimately gain access to the ESXi management network, and then hijack their ESXi host. So we really need to prioritize the isolation of our ESXi management network. We should be isolating our vMotion network. Typically, that's already layer 2 and not routable, so that's typically already done, but we should be verifying that. And then our vSphere web client, which should also be isolated. Only the users that need to get access to that login screen should be getting access to that login screen. And then any additional virtual machine network traffic that's critical to our business, we should make sure that we're taking the steps to isolate that as well. Now that blue box on the right-hand side, hardening practices for all areas and products, these are kind of general hardening practices. You'll see this checkbox on the next 3 slides. And again, these are good best practices that still pertain to VMware, and we will have guidance around all of these items as well. So patch currency, it's simple, just installing the latest and greatest patches, make sure you're current. For identity and access management, again, we should have strong IDAM practices in place. We should be using centralized authentication, and typically we recommend that for your infrastructure components, you're leveraging a separate Active Directory than what your user environment's using. This, again, helps prevent attackers from getting access to a user machine and then gaining access to your infrastructure. We can also should be disabling any default accounts that we're not using, changing our default passwords, leveraging role-based access controls, and then we should also be using unique service accounts. We shouldn't be using shared service accounts in the environment. And then we can add additional layers of security by leveraging two-factor authentication and single sign-on. For remote logging, we should be logging at the appropriate levels as defined by our security policies, our standards, and forwarding those logs to a centralized log server and auditing those logs to, again, give us visibility into what's going on in the environment. For monitoring, we can also leverage VMware ARIA for that additional performance and security context, as well as third-party tools like any performance monitoring you're using, your SIM, your XDR, EDR for your SOC teams to have that security context as well. And then lastly, we should just be backing up our environment on a regular cadence and then testing those backups periodically. For VCF, we're going to focus on the core components of VCF, vSphere, NSX, vSAN, and then the SDDC manager. So that checklist I just went over on the last slide for vSphere, you can basically just take that slide and put it here for VCF. These controls will be the same and similar. And then for NSX, Daniel is going to go over NSX in a lot more detail on the next slide, so I'm not going to steal his thunder, but he will focus on kind of 4 focus areas: protocol and port requirements, the NSX Manager appliance, the NSX Edge appliances, and then logging and alerting. For vSAN, keeping with our isolation theme, like I mentioned earlier, we need to make sure that vSAN network is isolated from the rest of the environment, and then that we are leveraging vSAN encryption to, again, ensure the confidentiality of our data. And for our SDDC manager, again, it's important that we isolate our SDDC manager from the rest of the environment and limit direct internet access for the SDDC manager. We can leverage proxies, for example, so that when the SDDC manager is downloading those updates, that it doesn't have full internet access, and we can control that. You can also manually download those updates if you have a dark site, for example, or if you just want to make sure that it doesn't have any access at all. We should be using approved certificates and then a dedicated service account. SDDC Manager plays a critical role in VCF in updating the other components, so we do not want that service account that it's using to do that to be a shared service account. We should also be deploying SDDC Manager with FIPS mode enabled, so we're leveraging the greatest encryption, and then scheduling automatic password rotation, so those passwords that SDDC Manager is using are always being rotated around. And then again, that hardening practice for all your end products will still pertain to VCF. And since I already went over that, I am not going to do it again. So with that being said, Daniel?
Yes, thank you. So before continue to the presentation, let's take 1 minute to summarize what we have been talking today, because a lot of information, right? Number 1, we talk about security assessment. We talk about the process, how we do a security assessment. We explain the reason why a security assessment and how often you have to have a security assessment. And then we move to hardening, the hardening process. Why hardening is important. Casey covered BSC hardening best practices. He covered BCS hardening best practices, and now I'm gonna continue with our last product today, or the last use case is about NSS hardening best practices. So first of all, again, this is a high-level view. There are so many documentation around it, and the list is exhaustive. But let's start with the very beginning, at least to give you an idea. Let's start with the basic. Protocols, upon requirement. Who in the room has installed NSX? Okay, I see a lot of people, so they're referring NSX. So as you know, when you are deploying NSX, you need to follow the port guideline. There's a documentation there. What are the ports that need to be blocked? What are the ports that need to be open? And some companies, based on the application requirement and security concerns, they do some workaround with the port configuration to the firewall, etc. So the first thing that I would recommend to do is you need to restrict the port. Just open the ports that are required. We have been in customer when they open everything, and then they come out to us, what's going on, what's wrong? Unfortunately, on this particular situation, when something happens, it's very hard to go back and fix everything because it's a big deal. The second part is, let's look at the NSS manager or the management plane, what we are recommending. The first thing that we're recommending is we're isolating the network, right? When we're doing a network, we're making sure that the manager, the controller at the transport node are in different networks. We need to, again, make sure that just not the protocol and the port are enabled. We need to make sure that everyone has a unique user. I know that it sounds like, hey, this is 101, security 101, but it's happening. We go there and we notice that many companies, they are sharing NSS user for management, or they have the common user for everyone. So it's difficult to track what's going on. Again, when we're looking at some other thing that we see is we talk about network time protocol. We notice that some customers, they don't have the right setting in place, and it's creating some issues. VMware we are responsible for our software, our product, how it's installed, and we support that one. But if you are installing third-party software, unfortunately, you guys need to deal with that. If there are any issue with third-party software, we don't recommend to use third-party software. Another thing that we're looking at is we're making sure that we're using only API access, using only TLS 1.2. The other versions are not secure enough. We are using approved certificate. I'm going to talk more about certificate later on, but make sure that you are using the latest and greatest certificate. Moving to the edge, you will see that there's a similar list, right? We need to isolate network. We need to make sure that all of the restriction at the port and protocol level is enabled. One thing that we notice is some customers, they have the customer data in the same network when they have the NSS edge. Big mistake as well. Be careful with that because hackers or people can access customer data easily. Again, you need to make sure that disable, like he mentioned before, secure shell, just open when you need it. Only the admin person. I'm not sure how the policy is going in different companies today, but you have to have a process in place for that. With the VMware NSS certificate, you need to be able to manage the certificate. You need to improve the proper certificate management. You need to make sure that there's only certificate per user, and you need to update and renew based on your company policies. Again, each user has to own a certificate. Now let's move a little bit to the security. For the people that they already installed NSX, most probably they installed because they wanted to use microsegmentation because the most popular feature when you want to do isolation and secure application or virtual machine, etc. So what we're trying to do here is, if you want to enhance your environment, please implement the right security policies. When we're looking at distributed firewall, it's more the east-west protection inside the data center. Another layer of security is when we implement intrusion detection and prevention. You can as well enable that, make sure that you have the right security policies in place, and you are able to manage policies consistently across the environment. We notice that some customers, they have different policies across multiple data centers when really they are managing the same application and virtual machines. And finally, I think a couple of years ago, we released what we call NSX Advanced Threat Prevention. Some other people mention, or they know through a network detection and response. Please implement that as well. It will be always checking your traffic and making sure that there is no malware or cyber threat in your environment. Moving to the final one. It's called NSS Gateway Firewall. It's more about north-south traffic protection. Probably all of you guys, they already have a physical firewall in place. What we offer as VMware, we have as well north-south traffic protection capability. How we do that? To the NSS Gateway Firewall. So again, kind of the similar situation with distributed firewall. You can create your policy. You can monitor what is coming inside and out of the perimeter. You can create or add IDS IPS for gateway firewall. And as well, you can implement advanced threat prevention. For these two, what is really more important is try to make it consistent across the network. I know that some of you already, they are using a centralized management system for policies. We recommend it to do that. And finally, final slide, let's talk about some resources. As Casey mentioned today, there are so many products. In 45 minutes, it will be impossible to go and cover the different products. But we have documentation in .com that is always getting updated. And to be honest, I would not recommend it to download and just keep in your computer. Because every month there are some updates, there are new versions and features. Notice that all of the documentation is based on software version. So you will see hardening guide for BCS 4.4, for BCS 4.5, for NSX 3.2, NSX 4.1. So make sure that you are using the right guide. But let's review very quick. I don't want to go one by one, but really what is this? Let's start with the hardening guide. Again, the first one is really, we are giving some guidance. We are giving you what are the best practices to harden and implement a good security posture for every product. The second one, BCS compliance kit. Maybe you are trying to meet a specific regulatory requirement. So we are providing you a kit where it will help you to achieve that compliance. We have another guide called Secure Technical Implementation. That one is used by the US Department of Defense. Maybe that's not applied here in Europe too much, but I wanted to let you know that we have some documentation for hardening defense system or government system. We have the product audit and applicability guide. We are helping administrators how to implement this security control. What are the different commands that you have to execute in the environment to harden your system? Firewall port and protocol, I already talked about it. It's a document for each product in VMware, what to open, how to implement, etc. And finally, VMware Security Advisory. This is something that is updated very often. Every time that you notice that there is a new ransomware in the market or a new malware, etc., VMware is making sure that we patch the environment to avoid get attacked for this. From this QR code, you can download the deck. We have time for Q&A, about 5 minutes, but Casey and I will be here the whole week. If any of you have any question or you would like to deep dive in some specific topic, let us know, because as I mentioned, it's a lot of information to cover in 45 minutes. Today is a high-level overview about hardening and assessment. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.